Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today's topic, audio review, weighing available approaches. Let's get started. Our moderator for you today is Mike Flanagan, General Counsel for Concilio and former litigation partner at Gibson Dunn. And with that, Mike, the audience is yours.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all for joining us today. Just to begin by introducing our other panelists. First, Bennett Borden. Bennett's an old friend. He's a partner over at Drinker Biddle here in Washington, where he co-chairs their information governance and eDiscovery group. He also, as of February of this year, I believe, was a founder of the Information Governance Initiative, or the IGI, which is a cross-disciplinary consortium and think tank dedicated to advancing the adoption of information governance practices and technologies through research, publishing, advocacy, and peer-to-peer networking. And Bennett, in my experience in this space in 20 years, is one of the people who's most knowledgeable about the law, the facts, and the technology. We also have two colleagues from here at Concilio, Robert Wickstrom, who's our VP for Client Development and Strategy, and Todd Mansbridge, who's our VP for Product Management. And Robert and Todd are two of our most knowledgeable internal resources on the subject of audio review. Just to begin, if we treat a generation as 20 years, I remember my first encounter with audio in a discovery context slightly more than 20 years ago, certainly before the popular use of voicemail at law firms. And this was an SEC investigation where the subject matter at issue was the auction of government securities, which happened at 1 o'clock on various dates throughout the year. And the SEC, in the course of our investigation, came to learn that the brokerage firm in question had audio tapes of the trading desk that were maintained not for regulatory or compliance purposes, but were maintained for business purposes, to ensure that a customer wouldn't walk away from a trade. And so the SEC became very interested in this, and I, as a young associate, had the pleasure of popping cassette tapes into a tape recorder at my desk and listening to, the 20 minutes before, 20 minutes after these auctions to see what was there, and many of these conversations end up being produced to the SEC. And here, 20 years later, I still have a number of recollections from that experience that I think are prevalent today. The first is, it really is an incredibly tedious process. I mean, the ratio that is used commonly is it takes 4 hours to review and listen to an hour of audio review, and I wouldn't disagree with that. The second was that although part of what we were listening to was phone lines, the other part was an open line on the trading desk, and it's a very challenging exercise to try and identify speakers, who's saying what and when. Third, call it needles in the haystack or signal to noise ratio, but there is a tremendous amount of information that is picked up on open audio lines that's completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. And some of that information is off color. Some of it is embarrassing to the speakers. Some of it is quite personal. Some of it is jokes during the course of a day. But much of it is stuff that you would not want to have a regulator listen to in the course of investigation. And then the fourth point from my experience 20 years ago that I think still rings true today is how powerful the use of audio is in a deposition. To see the face of a very well-prepared witness change when audio is played during the course of a deposition when they're under oath and they're forced to answer questions. It just is a different experience when compared to being presented with an email you wrote or an email you received or notes you wrote. So audio's been around for a while, but the lessons there are still present today. Tremendously powerful. We all had our I guess 2 weekends ago, the audio of the Los Angeles Clippers owner broke as a national story, and it's not. I'm not quite sure what else was going on in the world, but somehow this raced to the headlines. And we had, in the course of about 4 days, the NBA in effect banish for life one of its owners because he was recorded illegally, it didn't quite matter, but was recorded saying some horribly offensive things. And that investigation of yours, which was conducted by a very prominent New York law firm at the behest of the NBA, took place over the course of about 36 hours and resulted in discipline being handed out. And so audio was, and remains tremendously powerful. You can pick up tone and inflection and volume. Is someone whispering? Is someone yelling? You can pick up pauses and sighs and laughter. You can hear someone. You'll grow familiar with a speaker when you're listening to their voice and their approach to speaking and their cadence, and you can get a sense as to when they're being truthful, when they're not being truthful, when they're being playful, when they're not being playful. So I think all of us recognize, and most importantly, regulators who are trying to obtain this in the course of investigations, and litigants and their counsel who are trying to obtain this in discovery, and companies who are trying to obtain this and review this information in the course of internal investigations, all recognize that it's tremendously powerful. I mentioned at the beginning that when I had my first audio case as a law firm associate, there was no voicemail. Obviously, we all have voicemail now, although I'll confess I've been at Concilio for about 2 years now, and I don't think I've listened to a voicemail message. I mean, we've almost moved past voicemail where things get rolled over to your cell phone or converted to text that reaches you in an email. So voicemail's out there, regulatory requirements in terms of financial institution firms and others, not just maintaining audio for business purposes, but being forced to maintain audio for regulatory purposes. And then we've got the whole advent of call centers and telemarketing, where I think all of us, or those of us at least who still have landlines, probably all suffer from the fact that more than half of the calls that actually come into our home phone numbers are from someone marketing something when we're quite confident that it is being recorded for quality control purposes. So you always hear stories and statistics about the explosion of data in eDiscovery, but that explosion is mirrored with respect to audio as well. Along with that, we're seeing increasing requests for audio. We have had an audio offering here at Concilio for about 3 years. I think we've got close to 10 open audio matters. All of our audio matters are regulatory investigations. Almost all are for financial services firms, but some of them are quite large. I mean, we've got one matter where there's a team of, I think, 200 or 300 reviewers that have been listening to audio for more than 6 months, and there are tens of thousands of attorney comments that are entered into the database every day. In addition to regulatory investigations, increasingly litigants are seeking audio. And Bennett, maybe as our outside a practitioner, you could speak to your experience with seeking and having audio information sought in the course of litigation.
Hey, Mike, sure, and thanks for having me. You know, it's really interesting with audio because it is a terribly complex source of information in some ways, and yet technology has been brought to bear, like in so many other areas of discovery, to make it much easier to do. It's interesting to watch where we run into it a lot. As you said, you know, the regulatory, especially financial services compliance, you see a lot of requests for audio. Though we are starting to see it more in litigation, especially when asymmetric litigation. We're seeing a rash of requests when you've got individual plaintiffs or individual plaintiffs asserting class complaints or claims, especially in a couple of settings. There's a rash of TCPA cases going on in class actions now, which is the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And we're about to see another rash of those go through. This is a law that says that governs how you can be called for sales calls, and especially governs being called and have a recorded voice or message being played to you. Where we've seen this play out historically is in two areas. One is there's a difference between protection between a landline and a cell phone, and unfortunately, many companies, so think, you know, newspaper subscriptions or your local pharmacy, when they collect phone numbers, they don't necessarily have good information whether it's a landline or it's a cell phone, and so you see a lot of violations of the act there. The other is that the regulations are murky around what is an exception in this, what they call this healthcare exception to the TCPA. Where you're seeing this litigation come out is when there are a lot of the large pharmacies, so Walgreens and CVS and such, they have this policy now where many of them will call your phone with an automatic message saying that your prescription for such and such is up. Do you want to refill it? Press this button. They argue, and rightfully in my opinion, that is a health-related call and fits into this exception. There are studies that show, that people take their medicine more, that this is a good reminder, that there are better health outcomes. Where it becomes more of a question sometimes is when that call becomes more of a marketing call. This is where lots of the litigation is around. And so there's been a rash of these TCPA cases in the last, even year or so. And last October, the FTC, which issues regulations on the TCPA, changed the requirements for consent to make them even tighter, that you have to actually have some evidence of consenting to having a phone call on your telephone, whether it's a landline or a cell phone. And because these regulations changed and a lot of companies didn't keep up with those regulations, there's a whole other rash of TCPA cases. So because these, very often these kinds of calls are made by either large companies or the call service will be farmed out to a third-party call center, these calls are very often recorded. And precisely what the call said, what the wording was, actually matters with these TCPA violations. The other area we're seeing an increase in litigation is with wage and hour class actions as well. These are, again, for the last several years, there's been kind of a rash of these wage and hour class actions, especially in the hourly employee environment. So you're looking at retail stores in their mall or your, the local strip malls and things. And because there's been a lot of litigation around this, often the strategy in those kinds of litigation is to frankly harass a company until they cave and settle. And because audio has historically been very difficult to deal with, you're seeing a lot more requests for like complaint hotlines. Many times large corporations that have lots of retail stores, they'll have a employee hotline that employees can call in, or even managers can call in for help on particular issues. And so because these requests often are, or the cases are about, what your policies are around pay or overtime or off the clock work or things like that, it is a valid area of discovery to find out if there'd been complaints about this. So that's where we're starting to see it more in coming up in litigation. Interestingly enough, you don't see it a lot in what I call symmetric litigation, where it's kind of business to business. The most common, outside of call centers, the most common source of audio is voicemail. As you mentioned, Mike, most companies have this integrated telephone and voicemail system where if you leave a voicemail, it will send a WAV file or some other kind of audio file to your email. And that's very common. But because it is still considered very difficult to get at that information and how to review it, companies just kind of let it go. I'd probably say in well over 90% of the cases that I work on, those kind of files, voicemails, are just negotiated out of the process because it is felt that it is very difficult to get at that information. So unless a case is very much about or hinges on what might be in a voicemail or some other audio file, you don't see it much outside of the regulatory and this asymmetric litigation.
Yeah, that was my experience as well. I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom out there that jumps off the fact that audio recordings do constitute discovery information under Rule 34, but my sense is that when the rubber meets the road, it's either agreed not to be discussed or negotiated away in many situations. Let's just flip down. So we're going to talk about three different approaches to review today, two of which leverage technology that's out there now. And as we go through the workflow and the challenges and strengths for these, you'll see that depending upon your particular matter, one approach may be better than the other. The three we're going to talk about are human linear review, which is probably no different from the review I did 20 years ago. The second is a speech-to-text review, and the third is called phonetic indexing. There's a number of challenges to remember as you embark on this process. The first is, and we're not going to talk about preservation or collection issues today, but they are very important issues in terms of identifying the audio that's out there such that it can be gathered and made available for review. The second is the same issues in reviewing documents, privilege, proprietary information, personal information, are going to exist when you're reviewing audio, and they're going to be more complicated by the fact that frequently there's not some text you can look at and set its sound. Third challenge is who's speaking. I mean, you may not know who a speaker is, and it may be very important who a speaker is. And at some point, if you get beyond discovery and into trial, there may be proof issues and authentication issues. And then the reality is, in terms of challenges, is that while we do tend to communicate, for the most part, about a single subject, there's a reason I want to send you an email or a reason I want to send you a text message. Conversations, and particularly open line conversations on trading floors, are going to be diffused conversations throughout the course of a day on a range of subjects. So it may be that over the course of a single day, just think of your own conversations, you and a colleague will come back to the same subject over the course of a number of hours on a number of different occasions, rather than just sit down and say, for the next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about this subject. So there are some real challenges in reviewing audio. For all types of electronic discovery, the review is the most significant, I think everyone would agree, the most significant cost component. And the two factors there is what is being reviewed and how much has to be reviewed, and then secondarily, who is doing the review? What is the per hour cost of the person doing review? Is it a law firm partner? Is it a law firm associate? Is it a staff attorney? Is it some contract attorney? We're going to talk about some technology momentarily here. The greatest advantage of that technology is to cut through the silence, to cut through the irrelevant information, and to really focus the review and focus the human component of the review on the portion of the audio that's relevant, and then to correspondingly reduce errors resulting from fatigue, inconsistent approaches by reviewers, and the like. So three different approaches: human linear review, speech-to-text review, and phonetic indexing review. Why don't I have my colleague Robert Wickstrom talk us through workflow for human linear review and its strengths and weaknesses.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think when we talk about human linear review, what we're really talking about is when humans listen to an audio file or recording from beginning to end without the aid of any computer analytics. And as we think about this technology, it is probably familiar to many of us on this call, but some of the strengths that particularly highlight this is that humans in particular are quite good at processing sound and speech, in other words, conversational analytics. Another benefit of it is that attorneys, they have the ability to spend more time listening to the people that they're reviewing their documents and understanding exactly what are their speech patterns, what vocabulary do they tend to use when they're just in a relaxed conversational environment. Another area that might be useful is that human linear review process. It's been used by many firms and corporations in the past, so that when it comes to having to explain what you did or why you did it, it's a fairly accessible conversation to have. And then anyone that has a computer has the ability to perform this method of review. It's not a complex thing. If you have a computer with an audio player and some way to notate your comments, you can perform this review. So it doesn't take any computer experts. Some of the challenges that we see with it is that it's very time-consuming. It's not just a one-to-one. So if we have 1 hour of audio, it's not just an hour of listening time. It actually, our research shows that it's 3 to 4 hours of attorney time for every 1 hour of audio. It's limited in its methods of how you're able to filter what information you want to look at and when, or more importantly, I don't want to look at any particular information. And that is in large part because there's no real way to look or understand what the content of the spoken dialogue within the audio file is because we have not listened to it yet. And most important, as anybody who's worked in the legal process, when we're dealing with discovery, it's frequent that you will come across the need to re-review documents because new issues and or new facts have been learned. If you've already reviewed the audio file and you weren't reviewing it for those particular facts, you may be required to go back and review some or all of the population of audio again in order to account for that.
Hey, Robert, before we get to the workflow, Bennett, maybe if I could bring you back in. I know you're a huge fan of technology, but do you have you in any recent matter used this form of human linear review because based on your assessment it was the right approach to an audio review?
You know, Mike, I have, and you're right, I am a huge fan of technology, and this particular technology specifically, because in most circumstances you're looking at a volume business, right? You're looking for the needle in a haystack, and it's not just sometimes a needle in a haystack, but a needle in a pile of needles. And the technology cuts through that very easily. But that said, there are times where listening to that actual voice is very important. We had a case fairly recently where we basically there was a company that had some board members who were conspiring to pull off something at a company, and had a conspiracy going basically between them that they were voting one way and they were trying to make it sound like that they weren't. They were lobbying people to vote another way. Their expressed opinion was not the one that they were, was their actual opinion. And so there were recordings of these board minutes where it was quite evident what they were trying, that they were putting forward a certain position. But by being able to compare those voice recordings that were timed, because we had time elements with it, with what they were doing through email and through text messaging and chat in one case, and then what they tried to do subsequently with actually putting pressure on the corporate secretary to change some of the minutes, we were able to piece together this conspiracy, basically. But at that point, it was really critical to understand what they were saying, because they also tried to claim that they were kidding, or what they were saying was, you know, everybody knew it was a joke in the room, where it was quite clear on the audio that it wasn't. And so there are absolutely times where having an intelligent person sit and listen to something is quite critical of the evidence.
Thanks, Bennett. Bennett raised another good point there. Audio, I began by saying how powerful it was, but as powerful as it is, it's only one piece of the evidence. And one of the things that I think the technology can do today, and purchasers of technology should look for, is an ability to integrate that audio with everything else that's happening. I mean, as I am speaking, am I sending out emails at the same time? As I'm speaking, am I sending out texts at the same time? Am I receiving texts? Am I on Bloomberg chat at the same time? So you want to be able to, at 1:25 p.m., see and have access to everything that your custodian in question is thinking, doing, saying, writing, receiving. And if you can do that, and you can do that in one platform, you really got a tremendous leg up, rather than trying to, at some point down the line, marry the audio evidence to the text evidence to the email evidence to the handwritten note evidence. And so you've got to find a way to integrate all of that. Robert, why don't we go back to you to talk about a workflow setup for human linear review?
Thanks, Mike. And when we talk about workflows today, we're taking for granted that we're following a process that will allow us the ability to recreate, retell, or be able to QC the process. In other words, creating a defensible process for the purpose of reviewing and producing documents. A standard workflow may look something for human linear review like we're going to receive the audio, i.e. your service provider. We're going to properly vet that, make sure that it matches what the client intended to send as far as file counts and size and hash values. We're going to process that, and we're going to extract those audio files just like we would any other Word document or PDF or user-generated file. Then if possible, we may take a look at those audio files and begin performing some just basic analytics on them. Is there a way for us to begin splitting those files so we can move them or split them across more reviewers, or can we identify dead space within the file that can be removed, things like that. We might also, in the process, and generally with our financial clients, we'll receive information about the call that they record in a separate database. And so when we receive the audio file, we'll receive the audio file, and then in addition to that audio file, we'll receive some sort of text file that will give us information like who the caller was, what their telephone number, the date of the call, the time of the call. So we'll want to take that additional metadata and move that into the database that already has the information from the file metadata. In other words, marry those two metadata together. And from that point, what we want to do is begin processing the review phase of this. And so we're going to identify what files for what users or callers, if we have that metadata. And then they will just start the process of, they will receive a file as assigned to them. They will review it, starting at the beginning, make comments for particular times and particular facts that they want to keep track of. When they finish, they will just check that file back into whoever their review manager is, and then they will go on to the next file. And then after all of that's been done, the files that have met the burden for responsiveness will be provided in accordance with production protocols to the other side.
Thanks very much, Robert. If you could also handle speech to text, which is a technology that's been around for a while and can help as the volume increases quicken the time to review. So if you could maybe talk briefly about the strengths and challenges of speech to text.
Sure. I think first, speech to text, what is it? It's really the process of using computers to analyze the spoken text or the spoken audio, then comparing the parts of that spoken audio to a dictionary of known words. And generally what will result from that is a machine-generated transcript of the audio. And so when we talk about just doing speech to text, that's what we're really doing, is saying using computers to create a transcript of the spoken dialogue. And I think some of its strengths are if you have a really good sense of the words or the vocabulary, the terms of art that are being used by those people in those conversations. This can really be an effective way to generate a fairly accurate transcript. And that's excluding a lot of other really technical variables regarding acoustical signatures within the audio and background noise and accents and things like that.
How about some of the challenges for speech to text?
Well, I think some of the challenges with that are if you do not have a good grasp of the vocabulary being used, or if there's a lot of names and people's entities, terms of art, slang, this is not a very good way. You're going to get a very dirty transcript. It may even be inaccurate and unusable to an extent where it just doesn't help the process. The other area that it becomes difficult is if you're using multiple languages. They need to be accounted for, not just within the dictionary, but also within the transcription technology that's going to be used to generate the actual transcript.
Bennett, I know you're a big fan of phonetic indexing that we're going to talk about later, but in your practice, have you used this speech-to-text technology, and maybe share with us an occasion when you have?
Sure, yeah, we do. It's one of the it was the first technology, speech-to-text, before the phonetic indexing came about, so it was really kind of the only game in town. It has gotten better over time. I agree with Robert. The challenges really come into when you start dealing with accents or really weird terminology, very particular terminology, but it is very good for doing a rough analysis. Like many times we will use it in these asymmetric litigations where we'll negotiate a sample, or run a sample and run some keywords about a product, or for the wage and hour class actions, come up with some words, and really using it more for the defense to be able to show, take a valid statistic sample, being able to run some terms, do some accuracy testing, and really to knock out audio as a primary source. We've also used it in the regulatory setting, and we've been quite successful doing that. Again, large volumes, when you're looking at call center data or broker-dealer conversation data, that's just a huge amount of material where you've got basically almost 24 hours sometimes of audio. And so it's a really great way to cull down, but it certainly has its limitations. So you got to know how to workflow around those limitations.
Thanks very much. The next slide here, Robert, can you just talk us through again a high-level workflow for speech-to-text review?
Sure. I think, Mike, everything up into receiving the files and marrying the system metadata, that's all the same. We do add a process after that now where we're going to actually have to perform this index. And another challenge I didn't mention earlier was this particular type of technology is extremely resource intensive. In other words, it takes a lot of computer time to do this with good accuracy. Once we've run that index, we're going to begin running some searches, begin reviewing the transcript, get a good comfort level with that. We're going to batch out the results that we think are relevant to the review, and then the attorneys are going to review those audio files. Now, one of the differences here is depending on the technology, they may have the ability to, based upon that transcript, it might be synced with the audio so they can just click on a word and jump around. So there's some advantages if the technology supports it. One of the differences now, though, is because we're relying on technology, we need to think about providing some sort of mechanism in there to qualify any files that we haven't looked at. So we'll add a sampling phase, or it's generally recommended to add a sampling phase of any files that haven't been reviewed, and then we'll just go back into and find all the documents that the attorneys marked responsive and produce them.
Thanks very much, Robert. Let's shift to the third approach here, phonetic indexing. Here at Concilio, we've got a fully integrated patented phonetic indexing technology from a company called Nexidia. Nexidia also has, its technology has been licensed by a number of regulators, so in the sense of you ought to be using whatever the, I guess, the good guys or the bad guys are using, there's some comfort from that. Robert, Todd, could you take us through some of the strengths and weaknesses of phonetic indexing?
I sure can, Mike. I think first of all, I'd like to tell everybody sort of what phonetic indexing is, since there's a kind of a wide range of knowledge about this technology out in the marketplace. Essentially what phonetic indexing does is it creates an index of phonemes, and those are the unique sounds that make up a particular language, and then keeps that index along with some scoring or indexing of the likelihood that a particular sound is what the computer determined it was. Searches are entered as text, and then they're converted to expected sounds for that text in a way that allows you to bring back the portion of the audio where those terms are found. And it's very good at dealing with, through language packs, dealing with the differences in different languages, dialects, and accents. The big strengths around phonetic indexing are that it is very good at doing some of the things that speech-to-text has trouble with. Dealing with unique terms, terms that are not likely to be found in a standard dictionary, names of places, people, products, all things that can be very important in regulatory investigations, very important in litigation as well. It's a very fast indexing process. Puts most of the weight on the search at the end, and so the index is created very quickly comparative to speech-to-text. It has the ability to adjust thresholds, which allows you to find something that is unlikely to have been captured correctly, was likely captured in error in a speech-to-text process. You're now able to continue to dial down, and with the acceptance of, sometimes a number of false hits, you'll find that you can eventually find almost anything that's spoken relatively clearly. The big advantage that we find for our users of the system is that they're able to jump immediately to the portion of an audio, sometimes a long call, an hour, to those terms that they've searched for and quickly assess whether those terms are correct in the context that they're looking for them. So, many of the words that they'd be searching for could be used in multiple ways, but they're able to find out within a minute or two the 3 or 4 uses of a particular term in an audio track, and eliminate sometimes that hour of audio with within 2 or 3 minutes. Some of the challenges, it is at times a little disorienting that the only way to look at your data is to listen to it. Admittedly, you can jump, as I said, directly to those hits, but you are working without a lexicon, a dictionary, or a word wheel of the terms that are used in your data. And the other thing is that you may have to at times tinker with spelling of things like acronyms and the like. You know, how is a particular acronym pronounced in a particular area? So there's a lot of need for iterative back and forth consultative work with clients, both law firm and oftentimes end company clients, to make sure that you're looking for terms in the way that they would have been used. And that's one of the things that we like to mention about audio, is that any type of audio search technology demands a little bit of a different mode of thinking, really centered around the idea that audio is, it's language, direct conversation captured, and it's very important to have in mind that people use slang, that they use acronyms, that they say things in different ways than they would ever write them, even in the most informal, chat or other types of communication.
Thanks, Robert. Bennett, back to you one last time. Can you share with us an occasion when you've used phonetic indexing?
Yeah, Mike, and I'm in love with this technology. I, as you know, came out of the intelligence community before going to law school, and so this technology has kind of been in that space for a while, and I'm a huge fan of Nixidia. We have used it numerous times, and being able to cull through data. The thing I like about it the best is that it works on any language. Because it is phonetic, as long as you have some good exemplars of words in any language, you can make it work. This was really helpful to us when we've had some investigations where we have some recordings in English, some in languages in Asian, some in languages in Europe, and you just can't put a team together to listen to that. It's almost impossible. And yet being able to cut through some of that with this technology is really something. I mean, I cannot stress enough just how valuable this can be. But I will echo what Todd said too, though, is that approaching it, how you approach this technology, you really do have to think yourself through it. I'll never forget there was once, early on when the PCAOB was first founded, and this is, of course, the regulator that oversees public accounting companies, and it took us a while to figure out that the company we were looking at called it peekaboo, because the PCAOB, of course, doesn't really sound like peekaboo. The acronym doesn't work, but that's what everybody called it at the time, though that's somewhat frowned upon now. And so we actually had to look for. We didn't realize that we were looking for this peekaboo until we got into the data and talked to some people. So you really do have to know your data source, but I have found this technology really to be one of the better ones when dealing with audio files.
And Bennett, I mentioned earlier that it has been licensed to the government. Have you found when you're dealing with government investigators from governmental agencies, that they are receptive to use of this technology in an attempt to cull through what has to be reviewed? Or do you find, resistance or acceptance on the part of regulators?
It varies by the regulator, but certainly the SEC and DOJ, which are the ones who request this kind of material the most, it is not only kind of accepted, but even encouraged to be used. It used to be that trying to get at these audio files was very, very difficult. In early days, you were trying to produce this stuff, and they didn't want the audio; they wanted transcripts. And so now they're actually requesting the native audio files because they've got this technology. And it is a way to help reduce the overall burden. And so I've even negotiated search strategies, audio search strategies using this technology, and had a pretty good success with that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Todd, if you could take us through workflow for phonetic indexing, which may be a little bit more challenging than workflow for our first two types of reviews.
Sure, Mike. I think the capturing the metadata and overlaying it with the audio is something that's not entirely different from what we do with audio for the other types of workflows. The key really that we find is in creating good search terms and testing those search terms. And we favor an iterative process, one that involves consultants, project managers within our walls who've had a lot of experience helping clients with terms. And so we like to work with the clients, get a set of search terms out there, start to work with the search terms, identify flood terms, identify alternative ways of making the same sort of statement likely to have been used in text, likely to have been used in speech rather than single form that might be favored in text. And really working through that iterative process, which involves actually listening to a lot of hits, offering some of those hits up to clients so that they get a sense of how well the technology is working for the purposes of their investigation or litigation. After that, we batch out the hits for review, and the big advantage that, again, clients find is that they're able to go directly to those hits and can cut down really drastically on the amount of time that they spend listening to audio, which, as we mentioned before, can be a pretty energy and time-intensive task when they're listening to whole calls. Oftentimes they identify whole calls that they need to go back and listen to, but that process can be streamlined. It can be really engineered in a lot of ways to make it flexible and appropriate for whatever clients are looking to do with the technology.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I've got a kind of a blank slide here. What does the future hold? If I could go around the horn here, all of you are close to this technology and have seen it evolve. Bennett talked about use in the intelligence community years ago, but I assume that there are constant enhancements and improvements to this technology and technology in general that would help in the review of audio. But maybe if we could just touch base with each of you and have you share your thoughts on maybe some cool things that are out there to assist in audio review. Robert, why don't we begin with you?
Thanks, Mike. From a short-range perspective, I would think that the next technology that we're beginning to see manifest itself and enter the marketplace is the ability to blend the three approaches we talked about today. In other words, not removing the ability for a human to listen to it, adding the transcript and the ability to jump around and follow along in the transcript. And more importantly, when the transcript fails, to leverage the strength of the phonetic search so that you can tweak your searches based upon and account for different dialects and spoken speech patterns and things. In addition, I think with all of that, being able to go from a transcription and transcribe that or translate that into another language is the direction that we're seeing a lot of movement right now.
Todd Mandridge, how about you? How about an area where you see technology developing or being developed that can further aid in the review of audio?
Well, Mike, I know Bennett mentioned the intelligence sector, and I think one of the great things about audio technology is it's being driven by a number of sectors. The intelligence sector, certainly, call center management, compliance groups within companies and regulated industries. And I think what we're seeing there is that we can expect improvements in things like speaker identification, finding within a big set of audio where a particular speaker reoccurs. Language identification, I think, is improving. The broadening of language coverage, certainly a tool like Nexidia doesn't cover necessarily maybe all languages, but it covers a big, broad range. And importantly there on something like the Asian languages, there's continued development there and improvement in terms of dealing with the combination of a tonal language and sometimes multiple text forms in which searches can be entered. I think probably the most interesting thing that's out there kind of on the horizon, and we'll see how quickly it gets adopted and kind of brought into products in the legal space, but it's certainly being used already in call center and I assume in things like the intelligence sector, is an area called speech analytics. And what speech analytics is looking at is actually analyzing the speech to determine what's the speaker's emotional state. Are they in a state of stress? Are they angry? Certainly those are things that are important to a call center, but they may have implications as well for compliance and ultimately for legal. If you have matters where you're dealing with things like human resources hotlines and the like. These are areas where compliance and legal start to work together, and I think there's some really interesting technology kind of out on the horizon in that area.
Fantastic. Bennett, anything you've got your eye on over the horizon?
You know, those are great points that both Robert and Todd made. You know, this idea of text being separate from audio, this whole blending of that technology is really what we're beginning to see too. Some of the very cool stuff that's going on in like call centers, catching on keywords to elevate stuff. There's a call center we're working with now where if the caller asks certain questions or says certain words, it pops up automatically what the call operator could say or what solution they can offer. Or it's really quite extraordinary where we're seeing that. And the other place we're starting to see this is this kind of blended technology is where you have to look for analysis in online content outside of audio. I noticed one of the questions that came up on the chat panel here was what about audio from websites or Facebook or FaceTime and YouTube, things like that. And we had recently a huge case where we had what was on a YouTube channel really mattered. And it came down to we actually used audio technology to help filter down to the videos that you had to watch to see what a company was saying in an IP infringement case. So I love what's going on in this technology where you're starting to see understanding of speech getting better. You know, you look at like the Siri and you look at you know, what Google is doing, where being able to understand speech, like Todd said on the speaker ID, that kind of technology I think we're going to see impact us more as the audio becomes more rich and less kind of as a separate source of information.
Thanks very much, Bennett. One other question that came in, maybe I'll throw this Robert's way. We talked earlier about, or I mentioned, proprietary information, personal information, and obviously privileged information that may appear in audio the same way it could appear in any kind of writing. I'm assuming, Robert, this technology has a way to redact conversations, redact from conversations information which should not be produced to an adversary. Is that right?
That's correct, Mike. In fact, here at Concilio, we are already working and have working models of the exact technology. We just call it audio redaction. So we're able to identify particular parts of the audio file, and then we're able to render those within the audio file either by extracting them or by zeroing them out so that the information is no longer attainable even via forensic methods.
Bennett, here's one for you as a partner at a law firm. No different from, I suppose, review of documents, but what goes into your thinking about whether it ought to be an internal law firm resource or a contract attorney resource that's either, well, in this context, that's listening to your audio? Where do you where does your needle end up on that issue? How comfortable are you outsourcing, if you will, the review of audio?
You know, it all comes down to the defensibility and the level of accuracy I feel like I'm getting out of the review. There are times where, you know, all of us know where having human review from associates is not necessarily the best, and where very professional contract attorneys with great workflow is the best, and vice versa. And so to me, it is much more about, do I have a provable method of getting accurate information out of the audio? I will tell you, I tend to be much more of either an outsourcer or pushing that review down to a more professionalized workflow. You know, people who went to law school weren't necessarily taught and trained to be expert fact developers out of audio or documents, you know, and so people who are trained in that and who have become experts in that, it seems to me, is a much better way to go. But it all comes down to the defensibility of your process.
Thanks, Bennett. Todd, here's one for you. You know, obviously we find that the clients, when putting together a budget, want to know how much audio is out there, how long is it going to take to review, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How accurate do you find that you can be, we can be, in saying we've got this many gigabytes of audio, it should take, based on typical rates, this long to review? How good is our estimating with respect to review time for audio?
Well, I think we can be pretty good to the extent that you can estimate any review effort, there's certainly some variables in there that you never know at the outset of a review. A lot of audio products and offerings, including our own Next City offering, look at audio in terms of total hours of playtime. And that's a very good way to look at it, because that's a good way to compare use of a technology against linear listening, and particularly when you consider something like a 3 to 4 times ratio to listen to an entire audio and make notes on it. Those comparisons can be made pretty well. If we know what the compression rate is, the type of audio, it's pretty easy to get from gigabytes to audio hours. Now, knowing how much of a difference you can make through applying the technology gets into issues like how much prevalence is there of the search terms. Do I have audio about an energy trading floor, and the terms that are being asked to be searched for or forced upon our client by a regulatory group are very broad? That's the same problem in text as it is in audio, and it's a challenge that can make it very difficult to know how long is this process going to take. But we are able to apply some of our learning to know how well the technology will help us.
I'm going to just fast forward here to our last slide about questions for your provider. But maybe just once more quickly around the horn. Robert, client says we've got an audio issue. What's the first thing you say to them to get them thinking about their audio problem the right way?
Two things, Mike. Identify the person within the company who manages their audio solution. The second thing is sort of twofold. Introduce yourself to that person as their outside counsel, and grab an expert either from within the firm or from your service provider who is versed in walking clients through the discovery process for audio. It's many times they're not versed in this and it's foreign to them, and that process we talked about, marrying the metadata from the file to the metadata that's maintained in a separate database, can be a little tricky.
All right, thank you. Todd, same question to you. You're talking with a prospective client who has an audio issue. What's the one thing you want to be sure they understand after that first conversation?
Well, you want to generally engage and educate the client on the technology, and the key there is getting around two notions. One, audio is different. It's not the same as text in terms of the way that people express themselves and the sort of expressions they use. And two, this process works very well when there's a lot of exchange and kind of an iterative workflows adopted early on, so that the client is really engaged and involved in helping to trim the search process. But we also provide someone on our side who is listening to their data. A lot of text-based work in our industry has become so common and so commoditized that everybody knows the workflows. They know what they want to do and they know what they want. This is an area where there's a need for a lot more education and a lot more discussion at the outset of a project.
We've just had another question come in on the chat. With regards to audio redaction, maybe this is a question for Robert, how do you let the posting council know how much has been redacted? Obviously, we all know about President Nixon and his 17 minutes of tape, but how is that disclosed to the party seeking the discovery, that there's a redaction of 4 minutes and 12 seconds from this conversation?
Mike, that depends. That's going to be a legal conversation depending on how much information the attorneys wish to disclose and how they wish to disclose that. From a technical perspective, we can either split the audio file or extract the particular passages that they want to produce and just provide that information, which would include whatever information we would know about who the caller was and when the call occurred, but they would only be receiving the passages that the attorneys wanted to produce. If they followed the other redaction method where you actually blank the audio file, they would be able to hear in the audio file where that occurred. You could record that if so your technology allowed you to track that at a detailed level enough.
Hey, Bennett, how about you? Have you had experience when you're producing audio and there's some redactions that the first time an adversary hears may wonder what the heck is going on? How do you preview that, or how do you stage that for the recipient?
It is all about the negotiation and the privilege. There are times where how you interpret a doc request, and this is especially important to negotiate these things. Sometimes you'll have to produce an entire file. Sometimes you can produce only the snippets that are responsive. And so it always comes down to the negotiation. Typically, especially dealing with a regulator, you don't get a whole lot of chances to redact unless it is for privilege, and then you literally produce a privilege log that says, conversation between A and B for this point in time to that point in time. So it's, but it is, it's rare that it comes up, but when it does, it's all about the negotiation.
I think that's right. I mean, it's no different from you've got a long document that's got a little bit that's responsive. Do you produce the entire document, or do you black out the entire document and produce 3 lines from it? And that's going to depend on the situation and the negotiation and some strategic approaches. Well, we're at 57 minutes here, so I think we're going to wrap for today. But I want to thank Robert and Todd and Bennett for joining us and sharing their views on this important subject. I want to thank all our listeners for your questions. If you've got any further questions on the subject, there's contact information for all of us at the end of the slide deck, and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon. Thanks very much.